The advent of sound in 30s Britain brought the real horror of war to hundreds of cinema screens. On BBC Two Now, we continue shooting the century.
"30 years after the invention of moving pictures, the newsreels found a voice."
Well, ladies and gentlemen, how do you do? Here am I, enjoying myself down at Malvern. And there are you, enjoying yourself by allowing a photograph to talk to you.
In the most turbulent decade of the century, the voices the microphones came to record were both angry and provocative.
And I claim that in the ranks of our black shirt legions march the mighty ghosts of England's past.
Climax so far of the war in China, Shanghai falls in desolation after weeks of bombardment.
The sounds they captured were both loud and frightening.
The famous Suicide Battalion fights on, while Movietone's cameraman, Eric Mayle, makes an amazing film record of this nightmare siege.
But the new combination of pictures, commentary, music and effects now allowed the newsreels to convey as never before the momentous events that were shaking the world.
Our cameramen are spotted all round the globe. When anything happens in Singapore, there's a man ready to hop in a rickshaw. If anything happens in the jungle, there's a man set to charge.
By the end of the 1920s, the newsreel industry was dominated by half a dozen American companies, themselves controlled by rich and powerful Hollywood parents.
To the ends of the earth, our men will go, so that you may watch with your own eyes the most fascinating spectacle on the globe.
Even in Britain, the newsreels were either American-owned or had strong American connections. Only the Americans could afford to risk the enormous sums necessary to develop sound technology and install it in thousands of cinemas.
It was a major investment because it meant re-equipping all the cinemas with completely new projectors. So they knew that this was a multi-million-dollar gamble. They had to get this one right. They went around the world and interviewed highly newsworthy personalities. George Bernard Shaw in England, Mussolini in Italy, and so on.
I am very glad to be able to express my friendly feelings towards the American nation.
What they wanted to do was to burst on the scene, demonstrating that enormous leap, which actually hearing as well as seeing represents when you are talking about news.
King Alexander enters the car with Monsieur Bartou on his left.
At first, newsreels made do with little commentary. It was enough to let events speak for themselves, using sound recorded on the spot.
The car, under small escort, starts up the Canebière towards the fatal Place de la Bourse. Chaos ensues. The assassin is lynched.
For the better part of a year, The newsreel was just one of the most exciting special attractions that audiences could go to. For one of the few times in the history of the newsreel it made money. It actually returned some profit to its owners. People were fascinated with the phenomenon, the technological phenomenon of talking pictures.
Questioned by his own lawyer, Riley, the Bronx carpenter in German accent begins his string of denials.
On the night of March the 1st, 1932...
A high-profile celebrity court case, complete with riveting dialogue made for the perfect sound newsreel.
Defense attorney Riley listens as Hauptmann denies the kidnapping.
The trial of Bernard Hauptmann, who kidnapped and murdered the child of the world-famous aviator Charles Lindbergh, was an irresistible attraction.
The cross-examination grows more bitter. The most exciting hour in the most exciting of trials. The fiery prosecutor accuses relentlessly while Hauptmann's wife listens. "You conceal the truth," he shouts.
You conceal the truth from Inspector Bachman. You conceal the truth from the police. You conceal the truth from the Supreme Court Justice. You conceal the truth about your wife. You conceal the truth about the board. You conceal the truth about everything in this case, haven't you?
No, sir.
You have?
No, sir.
The prosecutor played not only to the jury, but to a vast newsreel audience. However, trials of the century didn't occur every day, and the newsreels fell back on zany stories.
Robert Earl Hughes of Baylis, Illinois, is just 20 years old, and carrying around those 720 pounds would tire out a fellow twice his age. His mother, Mrs. Georgia Hughes, says he was a perfectly normal...
Richards is the only man alive who can do this stunt, but after all, Mr. Richards is the only man alive who wants to.
Newsreels were desperate to find stunts like a man using his wife to test bulletproof glass.
When we look at newsreels today, we are charmed by them, but we are disappointed at the loss of journalistic opportunity. They appear oftentimes trivial and even childish, a witless form, someone called them. We must remember that newsreel was owned by the film industry. It was an entertainment medium, and in the United States in particular, spokespeople for the motion picture industry frequently spoke of the role of the newsreel to entertain.
The motion picture theater is the servant of the millions. It has never been able to afford opinions, attitudes, ideas, anything but sheer entertainment. Whether they know it or not, the newsreels are just in the show business.
After beauty contests, airships could be relied upon to provide arresting pictures.
3 times the Akron sailed around the field, trying to make a contact. Frantically, the men attempt to hold her back. Suddenly, the line snaps, and as the ship rises, she carries 3 men with her. 2 drop to their death.
The audience may have been the people who came to the theater, but the customer of Hollywood is the exhibitor. And the exhibitors knew exactly what they wanted, and they didn't want controversy, and they didn't want a think piece, and they didn't want too much intellectualization. They wanted strong action and recognizable events, and let's get it over with in 9 minutes.
By 1937, airships were old hat, and cameramen were reluctant to film the arrival of the Hindenburg. It turned out to be the most spectacular story of the decade.
A roar and a burst of flame near the big tail fin turned the ship into a flaming inferno.
The biggest catastrophe of the 30s, the newsreels just ignored. During the Depression, millions lost jobs, homes, and hope. But though there might be bread lines and soup kitchens for the starving right outside the doors of the theatre, they never appeared inside. There was no depression on the newsreel screen.
Every brother or sister who can spare a dime is going to the dog races in Florida this season.
The newsreels photographed what they thought the public wanted to see. And instead of seeing demonstrations and evictions, you saw flagpole sitters or marathon dancers or cigar-smoking babies.
Leo Seltzer filmed the world the newsreels avoided. He and others in the Workers' Film and Photo League captured enduring images of the Depression. They used silent cameras but even without sound, they were among the most telling images of the time. This is the only film of a 1932 hunger march by laid-off car workers in Dearborn, Michigan. It shows a violent clash in which 4 protest leaders were shot dead by Ford Company guards. Leo Seltzer showed his films in churches and union halls. They were a revelation to his audience.
When I got out west, I found that most of the farmers had the feeling that they were the only ones suffering. And when I showed them these films, they were quite surprised to realize that people in the city were suffering as much as they were. And it destroyed the concept that they had that people in the cities have all the money, just like people in the cities had thought that people in the farms had all the food. And both of them were suffering.
Whatever the intention, they had very little impact because they were never seen in theaters. They had a certain amount of impact to the extent that they were traveled around the country and you had special screenings, and there were some very powerful images there. But if we're going to talk about the newsreel as we know it, they didn't exist. They never had a chance.
The most dramatic footage was, in fact, shot by a newsreel company. On Memorial Day 1937, Chicago demonstrators faced off against the police. Somebody panicked. Ten demonstrators were killed by the police, 90 others wounded, many shot in the back as they fled. Paramount got exclusive pictures, but their news editor stated, "This film is shelved, and as far as we're concerned, will stay shelved." The Senate Civil Liberties Committee intervened to get it shown, otherwise the film might have been buried forever.
This film, having been shown in evidence at a public hearing of the committee, merits the attention and study of all citizens of this country.
Only then did Paramount release the film, but the police ensured it was never seen in Chicago.
May I introduce to you the members of the cabinet?
In Britain, the government embraced talkies from the start. The first Labour Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, introduced his 1929 cabinet in an early display of open government.
There's our friend Mr. Graham, who has got to come to the front in order to be seen, but not to be felt. He goes now to the Board of Trade from the Treasury.
Until the arrival of the talkies, the relationship between the public and the politicians was, of course, a far removed kind of relationship. What the newsreels have done, enabled to be done for the first time, was to bridge this gap, or at least to appear to bridge this gap.
The Chancellor of the Exchequer, with Mrs. Neville Chamberlain, stands on the steps of his residence, smilingly facing the great exposure by cinematograph and pressmen.
The people of this country...
It was Neville Chamberlain, Chancellor in a later Conservative government, who exploited the possibilities of the new medium to the full.
I've been able to do something to put the finances of the country into better order.
Chamberlain worked on the basis of professionalism.
They will have well-earned...
That you employed the best marketing agency, the best advertising agency. You also employed the most professional people in the film business to do your presentation.
And now we are beginning to get the reward of my obstinacy in sticking to sound finance and your patience and courage in bearing your burdens all this time.
Chamberlain was suitably coached. In fact, he was a very good performer, and most of it was done in a single take. but you can see quite clearly that this is rehearsed acting.
Another surplus? How on earth do you manage it? That's a question which I'm told has been very often asked of Englishmen by foreigners.
The effect of this on the cinema audience was exactly what it was designed to be. The cinema audience dominantly was made up of the very people who were most affected. It was a working class medium.
When it came to explaining the need for a tough budget to a nation rigidly divided by class, Chamberlain put on a perfect performance.
Yes, I do. I feel just that way myself.
Instead of generating this sense of these upper-class, rich, well-born people grinding us into the ground, they created a sense of a decent, concerned individual.
We couldn't be the only great country disarmed. We simply had to build our defense forces again, and we had to pay for it.
It worked brilliantly at the time, and it really does represent a very important stage in our history, or if you like, our development, and this is the beginning of the audiovisual age of politics.
The March of Time. Men of the Quarter assemble in the glare.
In 1935, the March of Time, a new-style crusading newsreel, was launched in America.
Practicing at his mirror, he schooled his booming voice in the gospel of discontent.
God, let me be a rabble-rouser. I see chaos
It exposed extremist politicians
and communism.
and gained access to places normally off-limits to the camera, such as the French Maginot Line. The driving force behind it was Louis de Rochemont. He'd been in the newsreel business for 20 years, but was impatient with its shortcomings.
He was a man of enormous energy. He was a force of nature, and he had wanted for years and had tried on his own to introduce a creative and interpretive newsreel, one that would restage certain sequences so as to sharpen the news.
Roy Larson at Time magazine had already created a hugely successful radio news show which did just that. He and de Rochemont got together to produce a newsreel version.
The amalgam of Larson and de Rochemont together resulted in 1935 in the introduction of the March of Time motion picture, and it was an enormous success.
Louisiana is in the grip of a decidedly un-American dictatorship of the loudest character the national political scene has heard in a generation.
Immediately it broke with tradition by targeting a senior politician, Louisiana Senator Huey Long. He was duped by the filmmakers into making a fool of himself.
Frankly a demagogue, he had been elected through his appeal to the people up the bayou. He promised and he...
They even persuaded his secretary and mistress to perform for the camera.
His pretty typist he makes Secretary of State and lets her run Louisiana when he is away.
As the First Lady Governor of Louisiana, I want to take this opportunity to thank my many friends for...
When Long saw the film, he was so angry he made sure that Louisiana extended censorship to the newsreels. The March of Time had arrived.
It was unique. We'd never seen anything like it. And it was greatly resented by a lot of people.
Alistair Cook was one of the commentary voices.
You could say March of Time expanded, dramatized, and popularized the newsreel. They transformed it. It was something quite new after the March of Time.
The March of Time didn't restrict itself to domestic politics. It campaigned on foreign issues too.
Some of its issues were profoundly controversial. The first full-length issue, in which only one subject was treated, was called Inside Nazi Germany.
Into fabricating the implements and machines of war, rather than to the productive industries of peace, go the resources and money of the German nation.
It sought to present the dark side of rising militarism and Nazism in Germany at a time when people did not know what was going on in that country. They sent some of their own people abroad to Germany, but of course they were closely controlled.
Still going on, as pitilessly, as brutally as it did 5 years ago, is Goebbels' persecution of the Jews. Signposts at city limits bear the legend, Jews not wanted.
The filmmakers got what shots they could, but de Rochemont wanted more.
Not even God stands above Hitler.
He demanded images of Nazi brutality. He demanded images of Nazis confiscating food.
Heil Hitler.
They were all filmed in America. These soldiers were in reality German Americans. They were supplied with the uniforms and the props and filmed in Hoboken, New Jersey.
He has just been forced to realize that he is the most suspected, most distrusted ruler in the world today.
Even Hitler himself was played by an actor in a New York garage.
What Germany had nearly regained.
Well, Louis, he had a rationale. He said, I've got the same right that a newspaper rewrite man has when he takes the telephone call from the reporter who's out on the street. And he says the rewrite man sits down at his typewriter and he rewrites the story in an entertaining, interesting fashion. He said, I have the same right to do the same thing. He said, I have some material that comes from the newsreels, and what is lacking to make the story meaningful, to tell the truth, to make it accurate, to make it vivid, I will stage.
Inside Nazi Germany was first shown at the Embassy Newsreel Theatre in New York. Such was the controversy surrounding the film, the city authorities stationed police both inside and outside the theatre. It ran for an unprecedented 16 weeks.
Nazi Germany faces her destiny with one of the great war machines in history. And the inevitable destiny of the great war machines of the past has been to destroy the peace of the world.
The film had forced Americans to confront the truth about Nazi Germany and the growing threat of war in Europe.
We can say that the March of Time redeemed the journalistic inadequacies of the newsreel. As far as the newsreel industry was concerned, they were not amused by the March of Time. They were not amused when it won an Academy Award 2 years after it was introduced for having revolutionized the newsreel, which it did.
The British were only too well aware of the dangers of war and did their best to avoid it. Neville Chamberlain had by now become Prime Minister. His policy of appeasement was strongly supported by the newsreels.
So our Prime Minister has come back from his third and greatest journey, and he said,
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine.
As we traveled back with Mr. Chamberlain from Heston, we drove through serried masses of happy people, happy in the knowledge that there was no war with Germany.
If I had to summarize the newsreel's line to whatever particular event they were covering, I would actually sort of use the words accentuate the positive. Accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, to use the words of the famous Bing Crosby song. That's very much the slant they took on whatever they were covering.
Posterity will thank God, as we do now, that in the time of desperate need our safety was guarded by such a man, Neville Chamberlain.
British newsreel company's line throughout the 30s was essentially one of not rocking the boat. And indeed, when the Newsreel Association of Great Britain was set up in 1938, within a year or so of that, they were organising meetings between themselves and representatives of the Conservative Party Films Association, the Conservative Unionist Party Films Association, whereby they actually not formulated policy, that would be going too far, but whereby they made it clear to the powers that be that they would actually follow and cover whatever the British government today considered to be of import and newsworthy.
But one American-owned newsreel company broke ranks over Chamberlain's trip to Munich.
A peaceful solution of the Czechoslovak problem.
Snatches of poor quality sound and some silent scenes are all that survives of the British Paramount story.
British and the German peoples.
The original showed a demonstration against the treaty being addressed by the Labour MP Ellen Wilkinson, and included interviews with opponents of appeasement.
There may still be a chance of averting the worst if we encourage the Czechoslovaks to stand firm and make our government understand that we repudiate its policy of surrendering our vital interests and of besmirching our good name.
Somebody saw this newsreel when it was released, reported it to Sir Patrick Gower at the Conservative Central Office, who got on to the Foreign Secretary's office, Lord Halifax, who for his part took umbrage that this kind of opinion might be forthcoming in any newsreel, given that the other 4 newsreels were so pro the government line, and then proceeded to approach the then American ambassador in London, Joseph P. Kennedy, head of the famous Kennedy clan, of course, to ask whether they couldn't do something to get this off the screen.
Mr. Joseph P. Kennedy, United States Ambassador to Great Britain, comes home again.
Kennedy brought pressure to bear on the head of American Paramount, who got back to the head of British Paramount in London, who got on to their own editor-in-chief, Tom Cummings, and in effect, all within a short space of 24 hours, that was sufficient to withdraw this seemingly offending item from the cinema newsreels, which was then very quickly replaced by Paramount putting out a story, Premier Flies for Peace.
The fateful hour of 11 has struck, and Britain's final warning to Hitler having been ignored, a state of war once more exists between Great Britain and Germany.
Appeasement had failed, but the government and newsreels still continued to march in step.
Following the declaration of war, the cabinet has been reformed. Mr. Anthony Eden is now Secretary for the Dominions with special access to the War Cabinet. Mr. Churchill, as in 1914, is First Lord of
the newsreels, they were immensely well liked by the public. They were treated by the government as a very important form of communication, exactly to those people who would have to do the fighting. That is to say, the people who would have to serve in the army, the people who would be bombed, the people on whose resolution, on whose belief that this was a just war, everything could turn. The cinema-going ordinary people, you know, those between the age of about 16 and 30, predominantly the working class people.
Already, Cockney humour is adjusting its wit to the new conditions.
The government, with the full cooperation of the newsreels, utilized that popularity, that liking, that trust, to the full in order to help win the war.
In Germany, from the very beginning, the newsreel was a vital part of the war effort. And Germany was not only winning the military battle, but the propaganda one too.
Reichsminister Dr. Goebbels verließ die Proklamation des Führers. Sie enthüllt zum ersten Mal vor der ganzen Welt die Verschwörung zwischen London und Moskau gegen Deutschland.
Joseph Goebbels was Minister of Propaganda. He controlled the newsreels and commanded the largest news-gathering machine the world had ever seen. Goebbels' head of newsreel production was Fritz Hippler.
Mit diesem Rohschnitt jeden Sonntag Spätnachmittag.
We'd take the rough cut to Goebbels every Sunday evening, to his home in Berlin or in Lankau or Schwadenwerder, and show him the rough cut.
Diesen Rohschnitt vor.
Goebbels demanded that his cameramen get as close to the action as possible, whatever the cost.
Für den Kameramann selbstverständlich sein musste, auch optisch.
It was taken for granted that the cameraman,
mit seinen Bildern,
through his pictures,
klar zu machen,
would make it clear to the audience that the bullets were whistling past his ears.
Ihm die Ohren geflogen sind.
Der Großangriff auf London nimmt seinen Anfang. Feststand des Reichsmarschalls. Pausenlos brausen die deutschen Geschwader nach England. Tag und Nacht belegen sie London mit Millionen Kilo von Bomben.
The purpose was to impress, and not just the audience at home. German newsreels were circulated abroad via Lisbon and were shown all over the neutral world. Also targeted were the then neutral American diplomats and journalists in Berlin.
German newsreels, of course, were shown in the theaters, but we'd get advance viewings in the propaganda ministry. And, of course, they were all carefully doctored by Goebbels, so that you never saw any dead Germans. You just saw war as theater, and most dramatic theater.
It was much harder reporting the Blitzkrieg from the receiving end.
Here in pictures is the triumph that turned a major military disaster into a miracle of deliverance.
The British were learning to turn heavy defeat into symbolic victory.
Here in one staggering shot, the Allied armies come out from the shore.
The control was just as strict on the British side.
That one amazing picture symbolizes the miracle of deliverance, which in the words of the Prime Minister was achieved by valor, by perseverance, by perfect discipline.
Every foot of film had been pre-censored before it was shown, and every word of the commentary was pre-censored before it was spoken.
And now we're on our way home. The ships are gliding into a British port.
So in that sense, it had a full-scale totalitarian, total war control. But this did not mean that they were not arguing, discussing all kinds of points with their controllers in the Ministry of Information, nor that those didn't listen to them. It was in the spirit of we are all in the same boat.
But peacetime attitudes died hard. Independently minded British cameramen didn't take well to being told what to do by the military. These images of French refugees were filmed by Ronnie Noble.
It was my belief that you should shoot anything that happened. And I remember one time the army were going to have an exercise about how to cross a canal. And they put the boats in the water and all but two sunk. So the soldiers were nearly drowning and God knows what. Well, I continued filming. The officer who was with me said, "Stop. No, I'm censoring that." And I said, "No, you can't censor it. If there's any censoring to be done, it's going to be done back in England. I'm going to film absolutely everything I see. I'm not going to pull my punches at all. And if it displeases you, I'm sorry, but it's up to somebody in London, either the censors or my editor, to decide whether or not to use it."
After the fall of France, Ronnie Noble was sent to North Africa. Just like his German equivalents, he was under pressure to show the bullets whistling around his ears.
The Western Desert was something different. There were no civilians, no buildings, it was just flat sand. There was nothing really to give it shape. And any man that was standing even 5 yards from the camera looked like a midget. So the thought of going in and filming action, going in with infantry, you had to be that close. It was impossible. You wouldn't have lasted, any length of time at all. In the desert, you really had to fake, because the genuine stuff looked like nothing. And one cameraman from Pathé came to me and said, "Look, my company wants shots of me in action. Could you do something for me?" So we went and found a rubbish dump in the desert, which we set fire to, and we made smoke. And our drivers put the helmets on, made them put bayonets on their rifles. And we made a kind of desert victory film. Great fun. Laughed at it, thought it was a great joke. And that was that. He thanked me. About 5 weeks later, I got a letter from my boss saying, "Hey, Pathé have just run marvellous film. of their cameraman in action, going into attack with the infantry. Why haven't you given us something the same? You know, can you do it? So that was a real fake.
The greatest double cross in history. Jap envoys talk peace in Washington. Jap planes, without warning, bring war to America. Our great Pacific outpost in the Hawaiian Islands is ruthlessly bombed as Japan's perfidious declaration of war. Death and destruction unleashed on a nation at peace. Our battle cry is, remember Pearl Harbor.
In December 1941, the United States was suddenly plunged into the war.
Here in the War Department is the busy center of a mighty organization whose directing genius...
It joined the propaganda effort on an unprecedented scale. Cameramen were trained by the school.
The military and the United States government understood early on that the reporting of the news to the home front was extremely important. All of the services had their schools for newsreel photographers. The March of Time ran a school for the Coast Guard, and a great deal of money and effort was spent to secure the very best material. I think the American government, for the first time, began to appreciate the power of the media to not only inform and to keep the home front up to date, but also to interpret the news in a way that was suitable and profitable. Combat cameramen were really brave in their coverage of the war. Many of them lost their lives and were injured. They fought alongside the guys with the rifles. And the quality of photography is excellent.
Even when film was damaged, editors would leave it in to convey the immediacy of the fighting. Out-of-focus images were included too. Authenticity, as much as technical excellence, was the order of the day.
There's a Jap.
In this shot, a Japanese soldier was caught in the act of throwing a bomb at the cameraman. The Pacific War produced some of the most powerful combat footage, but at high personal cost.
Casualties are mounting now, even among the combat cameramen. 9 fell taking these pictures.
In 1944, the tide had turned, and the most memorable scenes of the Allied landing were taken by a Canadian.
6 o'clock, D-Day. Landing time for the first beachhead boats. This is it. Now official cameras catch the full drama of the fateful hour. This is what you would have seen that D-Day morning.
You're in a little boat, you and the gang you trained with, and this is it. You're groggy, seasick all the way over. In just seconds, you'll be in. The door will open, and it's onto the beach. And may the bullets miss you. Here it comes. Then run.
The film could have been lost, that landing craft could have been blown up, and there wouldn't have been a single foot. It would have been absolutely nothing.
You're in, but 2 pals fall. This is D-Day.
Everywhere you looked in front, there was something happening. I think if I'd had 3 cameras, I could have just had them all going at the same time, all in different directions, and they'd all be picking up lots of action. But at the time, I had no idea whether it would be history or whether it would be special or whether it would be just thrown away.
The world's newest spotlight focused on the United States battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The fight that began at Pearl Harbor ends a stone's throw from Tokyo.
I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
Japan is finished as a major world power.
These proceedings are closed.
Stony-faced and silent, the Japs look on.
Suddenly the war is over. The surrender is signed on the battleship Missouri, and almost overnight, again, as was the case with the First World War, the agenda comes to an end. The focus of our attention shifted from very grim and unpleasant events to the promise of the post-war world. And it was a very promising world.
Spontaneous remarks of men and women in the street as the rising sun went down in the east.
Well, what do you think of the news, Harry?
Well, I think it's grand news. But after being on northern convoys all the time, I think it's a pity we didn't get a chance to have a go at the dirty, yellow, what's-the-names.
Of course, I'm only a housewife, but I'm so glad the Japanese are defeated and the World War is over.
Everyone was eager to get about the business of having babies and getting back to their careers. And the focus of the newsreel, the journalistic possibilities, the promise of it, pretty much came to an end.
This is the Gaumont British News, presenting the world to the world. GB News equipment is second to none in the newsreel world, and here you see our units leaving the labs. This camera car, the very latest design...
When the war was over, it was very difficult to settle down, both as a human being and as a cameraman, because all the jobs you've been doing were exciting, they were thrilling, they mattered.
Bond Street milliners open up their box of this year's Easter bonnets, presenting Marie-Lorraine.
Now suddenly you were doing beauty contests, a man who was pulling a train with his teeth, all kinds of stupid things like that.
With feminine attractions now somewhat obscured from view by a longer line, it's at the opposite end that womanly charm will have to be built up.
That's what the newsreels wanted. They were to entertain, and they were the things we were doing. I didn't like it particularly, but I did enjoy being in civilian life again.
Once again, Grand National Day. For punters, it's a double or nothing. But if the favourite completes the spring double, it's a bookie's funeral.
For the newsreels, it was back to the old pre-war routine.
4.5 mile stretch in front.
The scriptwriter of this story was a former parachutist, fresh from the war.
The newsreels did do a good job in sporting events. And on those days, on Grand National Day and Derby Day, the newsreels pulled out all the stops.
Beecher's Brook, and it's still Acton Major leading from Astra, What No Sun, Royal Mountain Cromwell. Heading out for the first turn.
One did one's best to write a reasonable commentary, 2 words to a foot of film, all that stuff. But it was, I mean, to say it was journalism is exaggerated. It was a form of journalism. It was a form of cinema newsreel journalism. I'm not ashamed of it in any way whatsoever. On the other hand, I don't recall it with a great deal of relish.
The BBC brought into use for the first time its latest EMI outside broadcast equipment.
But the world was changing beyond recognition. After a wartime interruption, television was back to stay.
Now, hold it, Mitt.
It was primitive and still only reached a small audience, but it was invading even the newsreel's bastion of sports coverage.
I had to cover Wimbledon, and I was having a drink in one of the bars, and I suddenly heard a noise that indicated that the final was over, and rushed up with the camera to get on the centre court, and just got in time for the presentation. Breathed a sigh of relief, went to the office, put the film in for developing, and my boss said, you only just made it, didn't you? So I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I saw on television that you just arrived in time to do the presentation. He said, you know, that's not good enough. I said, you've seen it today when it happened, and my film won't be available for 3 days? He said, that's right. So really, you know, it was coming then, and I think many of us saw the danger.
With many of his colleagues from the cinema newsreels, Ronnie Noble went to television and off to the Korean War.
The newly built double bridge over the Han River leading into Seoul, capital of South Korea, forms the background for the first report from our new cameraman in Korea, Ronnie Noble. Joining the rumble of military traffic...
The cameraman then moved from the cinema newsreels to television, and they brought a skill and a craft and a genius, in a way, to television newsreel.
Back in those grim January days.
Particularly, I mean, I'm thinking of issues like the Korean War.
The pulse of the city is beginning to beat anew, slowly.
The cinema newsreel coverage was pathetic. Television newsreel sent cameramen out to cover the Korean War.
A few shops have already opened.
And not only did they get excellent pictures, but they were the first people to bring proper reports.
But even greater than the fear of famine is the dread of an epidemic. For typhus has been reported among some of the refugees.
The cinema newsreel, in the end, was a slightly phony thing. It didn't really deal with proper issues. The main interests were pictures. It was dominated by people who were interested in pictures. It was not dominated by people who were interested in ideas, or ideals, or issues, or clashes, or politics, or any form of journalism, really. And therefore the introduction of journalism into the cinema newsreel might have prolonged their life for a little while. But in the end, the immediacy of television won the day.
This is Movietone. Leonard Martin reporting. To celebrate Movietone's 50th anniversary, let's take a look at London from the air, beginning with that extraordinary piece of Victoriana, Tower Bridge.
This last British newsreel was shown in 1979.
Just 85 years old.
Despite the addition of colour, it was by now a pale reflection of its former self.
The newsreels certainly didn't fulfill all the expectations which were pinned upon it when it was born.
Now London's river is almost silent.
On the other hand, the newsreel has made the world of the time a more colourful, a more interesting, and above all, a far less boring place in terms of news than it could have been otherwise.
It was the newsreel that gave us the image not only of distant places and people, of kings and queens and celebrities and of battles, of sports events. It gave us a way of looking at a world which in most cases, in the early part of this century, most citizens would never have a chance to experience themselves.
They are making me a signal by which I understand that they have had about enough of me. I am very reluctant to leave you, ladies and gentlemen, but you see, they can cut me off at any moment. And therefore, to save myself from that humiliation, I must bid you good morning.
David Essex offers his personal admiration for Frank Sinatra next here on BBC Two. And then at 4, Old Blue Eyes in not-so-charming form, Assault on a Queen.